The fever broke just as Dr. Samuel Whitmore pressed the cool cloth against little Emma Calloway's forehead. Her breathing steadied, no longer the shallow gasps that had brought her father racing through the night to pound on the clinic door. The doctor's hands remained perfectly steady as he checked her pulse, counting the beats with the same precision he brought to every medical task. Outside, the morning sun painted Millbrook's dusty main street in golden light. The town was waking up slowly, shopkeepers sweeping their porches and preparing for another quiet day. Dr. Whitmore had been their only physician for 7 years now, arriving from back east with little explanation and fewer possessions. Just his medical bag, his instruments, and a gentle manner that put even the most frightened patients at ease. He was cleaning his hands in the wash basin when the sound of approaching horses cut through the peaceful morning. Not the leisurely clip-clop of townspeople going about their business, but the hard gallop of men with purpose. Dr. Whitmore glanced through the clinic window and saw 5 riders pulling up outside Henderson's general store across the street. The leader was a bear of a man with a black beard and cold eyes. Dutch Carver, though the doctor didn't know his name yet. What he could see was the man's easy cruelty in the way he dismounted and strode into the store like he owned it. The other 4 followed, hands resting casual on their gun butts. From his clinic window, Dr. Whitmore watched Mrs. Henderson emerge from her store, her face pale as winter moonlight. She was wringing her hands in her apron, the way people did when bad news arrived unexpectedly. The big man was talking to her, his voice carrying across the street though the words weren't clear. What was clear was the fear in her posture and the satisfaction in his. The transaction was brief and brutal. Mrs. Henderson disappeared back into her store and returned with a small cloth bag that clinked when she handed it over. The big man weighed it in his palm, nodded approval, then said something that made her flinch. When they mounted up to leave, one of the riders deliberately knocked over the barrel of apples she'd arranged out front. Red fruit scattered across the wooden walkway like drops of blood. Dr. Whitmore was already reaching for his medical bag when he saw Mrs. Henderson stumble and fall trying to gather the spilled apples. By the time he crossed the street, she was sitting on the ground rubbing her twisted ankle, tears mixing with the dust on her cheeks. But before we see what happens next, if you're enjoying this story so far, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Comment below with what state or country you're in. These tales of courage and justice seem to resonate everywhere, and it's wonderful to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's see how a healer responds when his community is under threat. "Let me help you with that ankle, Mrs. Henderson," the doctor said, kneeling beside her with his familiar gentle manner. She looked up at him with grateful eyes, though worry lines creased her forehead deeper than her years should have allowed. "They come every month now," she said quietly as he examined her ankle. "Started 3 months back, right after my Thomas died. Protection money, they call it." "Protection from what?" I asked them. "From us," the big one said, and laughed like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Dr. Whitmore's hands remained steady as he wrapped her ankle, but something cold flickered behind his pale blue eyes. In his 7 years in Millbrook, no one had seen that particular expression cross his weathered face. It was there and gone so quickly that Mrs. Henderson missed it entirely, focused as she was on her injury and her troubles. The gang had visited 3 other businesses before reaching her store, she explained. The blacksmith, the saloon, even old Pastor Williams at the church. Everyone paid because everyone was afraid. Sheriff Mills was just a boy really, barely 20, and with no experience handling men like these. "How much do they want from you?" the doctor asked, helping her to her feet and testing her weight on the wrapped ankle. $20 a month. Might as well ask for the moon. I barely make enough to keep food on my table and the store running. Mrs. Henderson's voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. "But what choice do I have? They made it clear what happens to folks who don't pay." Dr. Whitmore steadied her as she took a tentative step. His touch was gentle, but she noticed something different about his hands. They were softer than a working man's, true enough, but there were small scars across the knuckles and a peculiar callus on his trigger finger that she'd never paid attention to before. "What did your Thomas used to say about steady hands?" the doctor asked quietly, more to himself than to her. "Oh, that old saying of his." Mrs. Henderson managed a sad smile. "He always said doctors had the steadiest hands in the territory. Had to, he'd say, when people's lives depended on not shaking at the wrong moment." Used to tell me you could always spot a surgeon by watching him pour coffee or thread a needle. Never a tremor, never a mistake. Dr. Whitmore nodded thoughtfully. Your husband was a wise man. Some skills, once learned, never leave you. He walked her back into her store and helped her arrange what was salvageable from the scattered apples. As he worked, Mrs. Henderson found herself studying his movements more carefully. Every gesture was economical, precise. When he picked up the fallen fruit, he never fumbled or dropped a piece. When he lifted the heavy barrel back into position, he moved it like it weighed nothing at all. They'll be back, she said as he prepared to leave. The big one. Dutch, he looked real interested when he saw your clinic. Probably figure a doctor must have money tucked away somewhere. Dr. Whitmore paused in the doorway. The afternoon light caught his face, and for just a moment Mrs. Henderson saw something that made her breath catch. It wasn't fear or worry like she expected. It was the look of a man making calculations, measuring distances and possibilities with the same precision he brought to measuring medicine. Let me know if that ankle gives you trouble, he said, and his voice was warm and gentle again. Sometimes old injuries have a way of teaching us things we'd rather not remember. He walked back across the street to his clinic, and Mrs. Henderson watched him go with a puzzled expression. Something about the way he moved didn't match the soft-spoken healer she'd known for 7 years. His steps were too even, too measured, like a man who'd learned to walk silently through dangerous places. Inside his clinic, Dr. Whitmore set his medical bag on the examination table and began organizing his instruments. His hands moved with their usual steadiness as he cleaned and arranged each tool. Scalpels, forceps, bone saws, all gleaming sharp and perfectly maintained. Tools for healing, every one of them. But as he worked, his mind was elsewhere, calculating the odds and remembering lessons he'd hoped never to use again. 5 men, well-armed, experienced in intimidating civilians. They'd grown comfortable in their dominance over Millbrook, careless in their assumption that no one would stand against them. Dr. Samuel Whitmore had spent 7 years learning to save lives. Before that, he'd spent 3 years learning to take them with surgical precision from distances that most men couldn't even see clearly. He'd come west hoping never to need those particular skills again. As the sun set over Millbrook, painting the sky the color of old blood, the good doctor prepared for his evening rounds. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight there were still patients to tend, wounds to heal, lives to preserve. It was honest work, peaceful work. The work of a man who'd found his calling late in life, after losing his way entirely. Outside his window, Dutch Carver's gang made camp just beyond the town limits, already planning their return visit to collect from the wealthy doctor. They went to sleep confident in their power over the frightened little community, never suspecting that one of those frightened sheep had once been a very different kind of predator entirely. The night passed quietly, with only the gentle sounds of a healer going about his work. But tomorrow would tell a different story. The clinic door slammed open just as Dr. Whitmore finished bandaging young Tommy Patterson's split lip. The boy had taken a tumble from his horse that afternoon, and his mother had fretted over him like he'd broken every bone in his body. Now the child sat frozen on the examination table, eyes wide as 5 armed men filled the small space. Dutch Carver ducked under the doorframe, his massive frame blocking most of the lamplight from the street. His cold eyes swept the room, taking inventory of everything valuable while his men spread out behind him. The smell of whiskey and unwashed leather followed them inside like a threat. "Evening, Doc," Dutch said, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake oil salesman. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important." Dr. Whitmore placed himself between the gang and his young patient without seeming to move at all. His hands remained steady as he continued wrapping Tommy's bandage, though his pale blue eyes never left the intruders. "Mrs. Patterson, please take Tommy home through the back door," the doctor said quietly. "Come see me tomorrow if the swelling doesn't go down." The woman scooped up her son and fled through the rear exit without a word. The door had barely closed behind them when Dutch's demeanor shifted from false politeness to naked intimidation. "Smart woman. Knows when to make herself scarce." Dutch stepped closer, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "We're here on business. Document official business." "What kind of business brings 5 armed men to a medical clinic after dark?" Dr. Whitmore asked, his tone remaining conversational as he began cleaning his instruments. The kind that keeps this town safe and prosperous, Dutch replied, settling his considerable bulk into the doctor's chair without invitation. See, Doc, we've been talking to the other business owners around here. Everyone understands the value of protection in these uncertain times. Dr. Whitmore continued organizing his medical supplies, each movement precise and unhurried. The gang members shifted restlessly and used to such calm in the face of their presence. Most folks got nervous real quick when Dutch Carver paid a visit. I'm afraid I don't understand what protection you're referring to, the doctor said. Millbrook is a peaceful community. We haven't had any trouble here. Dutch laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. That's because we keep it that way. Document. Bad things happen to towns that don't have proper protection. Fires, accidents, people getting hurt in unfortunate ways. One of Dutch's men, a wiry fellow with yellow teeth named Pike, snickered and knocked over a bottle of carbolic acid. The liquid splashed across the floor, filling the room with its sharp medicinal smell. Oops, Pike said without any hint of apology. Clumsy of me. Dr. Whitmore watched the precious disinfectant spread across his clean floor. That bottle cost me $3. It came all the way from San Francisco. Dutch stood up slowly, using his size to intimidate. $3, you say? Well, Doc, our protection services only cost $20 a month. Seems like a bargain when you consider how many expensive accidents we prevent. The doctor's hands paused in their cleaning for just a moment before resuming their steady work. I'm afraid you've made a mistake, gentlemen. Everything I earn goes directly back into medical supplies and equipment. I have no money to spare for unnecessary services. Now that's disappointing to hear, Dutch said, stepping closer until he loomed over the smaller man. Because the way I see it, a doctor's got to have money. People don't pay for healing with chickens and promises. Dr. Whitmore turned to face him directly, and something in his posture made Dutch hesitate. The doctor stood perfectly still, balanced on the balls of his feet in a way that suggested readiness rather than relaxation. You'd be surprised how often they do exactly that, the doctor said calmly. Mrs. Chun brings me vegetables from her garden. The Miller family gives me eggs. Pastor Williams offers prayers and spiritual counsel. I've learned to find value in things that can't be counted in coins. Dutch's patience snapped like a dry twig. He grabbed the doctor's wrist in his massive hand, squeezing hard enough to hurt. These are soft hands, boys. Never done a day's real work. Look at them, clean and smooth like a woman's. Dr. Whitmore looked down at his captured wrist with mild interest, as if studying a medical condition. His voice remained steady and clinical. You're applying approximately 40 pounds of pressure to my radius and ulna. Interesting that you choose to demonstrate your strength through causing pain to someone who dedicates his life to relieving it. Dutch squeezed harder, expecting to see fear or submission. Instead, the doctor's expression remained thoughtful and detached. That's peculiar, the doctor observed. Most people would be showing signs of distress by now. Elevated heart rate, perspiration, verbal protests. It appears my tolerance for discomfort is higher than average. The casual tone unsettled Dutch more than screaming would have. He released the doctor's wrist and shoved him backward, trying to provoke a reaction. Dr. Whitmore stumbled, but caught himself against the medicine cabinet with practiced ease. You think you're better than us, don't you, Doc? Dutch snarled. Sitting here in your clean little clinic, looking down on honest working men. I think everyone deserves medical care regardless of their circumstances or choices, Dr. Whitmore replied, rubbing his wrist absently. I've taken an oath to do no harm. I'd prefer not to break it. The statement hung in the air like a warning, though Dutch was too angry to hear the steel beneath the silk. He backhanded a shelf of medicine bottles, sending brown glass crashing to the floor. Laudanum, mercury, digitalis, carefully compounded remedies that had taken weeks to prepare scattered like broken promises. Pike and the other men joined in the destruction, overturning tables and smashing equipment with gleeful enthusiasm. They'd done this dance before in other towns, and resistance always crumbled quickly once folks saw their livelihood being destroyed. Dr. Whitmore watched the carnage with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. When Pike grabbed a bottle of chloroform and raised it over his head, the doctor spoke quietly. That particular compound is extremely volatile. If the vapor reaches the oil lamp, it will explode with sufficient force to bring down the roof. Just thought you should know. Pike hesitated, looking to Dutch for guidance. The big man scowled, but nodded for him to put it down. They wanted to send a message, not burn down half the town. Smart man, doctor. Dutch grabbed the front of the doctor's shirt and slammed him against the surgical cabinet. Glass doors shattered, and bright steel instruments cascaded to the floor like deadly rain. You're going to learn real quick that being clever ain't the same as being wise. A shard of window glass sliced across Dr. Whitmore's left hand, opening a clean line from wrist to knuckle. Blood welled up immediately, bright red against pale skin. Dutch expected to see pain, fear, maybe even tears. Instead, the doctor looked at his wounded hand with professional interest. Approximately 3 inches long, 1/4 inch deep, missing the major blood vessels and tendons. He reached for a clean cloth with his uninjured hand and began wrapping the wound with movements that were economical and precise. Dutch and his men watched in fascination as the doctor treated his own injury. There was no fumbling, no hesitation, no wasted motion. The bandage was applied with the same steady competence he'd shown wrapping Tommy Patterson's split lip. Most folks would be shaking like leaves after what just happened, Pike observed uneasily. Dr. Whitmore tested the tightness of his bandage and nodded approval. Shock is a common response to trauma. However, I find that maintaining focus during crisis situations tends to produce better outcomes. He began gathering his scattered instruments, sorting them by type and function despite the destruction around him. His movements were methodical, unhurried, almost meditative. It was deeply unsettling to men who were used to their violence producing immediate submission. Dutch felt his authority slipping and tried to reassert it through proximity and threat. Tomorrow morning, document. You have until tomorrow morning to come up with our money. $20, cash, or we come back and finish what we started here. And if I don't have $20 by morning? The doctor asked without looking up from his work. Then we'll have ourselves a conversation about the cost of medical care in a town with no doctor, Dutch growled. Accidents happen, document. People get hurt. Be a real shame if there wasn't anyone around to patch them up. Dr. Whitmore straightened slowly, a bone saw gleaming in his good hand as he placed it carefully in its designated spot. I understand your position clearly. You're betting that my concern for my patients outweighs my principles. Dutch grinned, thinking he'd finally gotten through to the stubborn healer. Now you're starting to make sense. The doctor's pale eyes met Dutch's dark ones directly, and something passed between them that made the big man's confidence waver. What Dutch saw in those eyes wasn't fear or submission. It was assessment, calculation, the look of a professional evaluating a problem. I've spent 7 years in this community building trust and saving lives, Dr. Whitmore said quietly. Every person in Millbrook knows they can count on me when they're hurt or sick or afraid. That's not a responsibility I take lightly. Good, Dutch said, though he sounded less certain than before. But I should mention something that might interest you, the doctor continued, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone. Before I became a healer, I had a different profession. Different skills, different purposes. I came here hoping never to need those particular abilities again. Pike shifted nervously. What kind of different profession? Dr. Whitmore continued organizing his instruments with mechanical precision. The kind where steady hands meant the difference between success and failure. Where a 1/4 inch of error could mean everything. Where 43 men learned too late that underestimating someone can be a fatal mistake. The number hung in the air like smoke, and Dutch felt something cold crawl up his spine. 43 was too specific to be a bluff, too precise to be accidental. You threatening us, Doc? Dutch asked, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Dr. Whitmore looked up from his work, and his eyes held the kind of calm that came from absolute certainty. I don't make threats. I state medical facts. And the fact is, gentlemen, that some wounds can't be healed. Some damage is permanent. The gang filed out slowly, their earlier swagger replaced by thoughtful silence. Dutch paused in the doorway, trying to salvage some authority. Tomorrow morning, document. Have our money ready. Dr. Whitmore returned to organizing his scattered supplies, his injured hand working as steadily as the uninjured one. I'll be here, he said simply. After they left, the doctor continued his methodical cleanup, sorting salvageable medicines from broken glass and ruined compounds. His movements remained precise despite the destruction, professional despite the provocation. Outside, Dutch's gang mounted their horses and rode slowly back to their camp. They'd accomplished their goal of intimidating the doctor and making their demands clear. But somehow, none of them felt like they'd won anything at all. Inside his ruined clinic, Dr. Samuel Whitmore finished bandaging his hand and began planning for tomorrow's inevitable return. He'd spent 7 years learning to heal. Before that, he'd spent 3 years learning something entirely different. Tomorrow he might need to remember which lesson served better. The broken glass caught the lamplight like scattered stars as Dr. Whitmore swept the debris into careful piles. His bandaged hand moved with the same steady precision as always, showing no sign of tremor despite the violence he'd endured. Each shard was collected methodically, sorted by size and type, then disposed of in a way that wouldn't endanger anyone who might step on the remains. Most men would have hands shaking like autumn leaves after what Dutch Carver had done to his clinic. Most men would be pacing the floor, cursing their luck, maybe even packing up to flee town before morning came. Dr. Samuel Whitmore simply continued his work with the calm focus of a professional who'd learned long ago that panic served no useful purpose. He was inventorying his remaining medical supplies when Sheriff Mills appeared in the doorway, his young face pale with concern and his hand resting nervously on his gun butt. The boy couldn't be more than 22, fresh-faced and earnest in the way that only came from never having killed anyone. "Sweet Mary, Doc, what happened here?" Mills stepped carefully around the broken glass, his eyes taking in the destruction with growing anger. This was Dutch Carver's work, wasn't it? Dr. Whitmore looked up from his inventory, noting how the young sheriff's hands trembled slightly with righteous fury. "It was a business disagreement," he said mildly. "Nothing that can't be cleaned up and forgotten." "Business disagreement?" Mills's voice cracked with indignation. "Doc, they destroyed half your equipment. There's blood on the cabinet. Your hand is bandaged up. This isn't some simple misunderstanding." The doctor returned to his work, placing salvageable bottles in neat rows according to their contents. "Violence is rarely as complicated as people make it seem, Sheriff. Someone wants something, someone else refuses to provide it, and the matter escalates until one side decides the cost is too high to continue." Mills watched the older man work, struck by something that didn't quite fit. Any normal person would be upset, angry, maybe even scared after what had happened here. But Dr. Whitmore moved through the wreckage with the same calm competence he showed when treating patients. "Doc, you're taking this awful steady for a man who just got roughed up by the worst gang in 3 counties, Mills observed. "Most folks would be planning to catch the next stage out of town." Dr. Whitmore paused in his sorting, his pale eyes meeting the sheriff's worried gaze. "Running away doesn't cure the disease, Sheriff. It just spreads it to the next community down the line." The young man shifted his weight uncomfortably, clearly wanting to help but unsure how to proceed. "My father used to say something similar during the war. He served with the Ohio Infantry, saw action at Gettysburg and Antietam. Always said the hardest part wasn't facing the enemy. It was watching good men run when they should have stood their ground." Dr. Whitmore's hands stilled completely for the first time since Mills had arrived. Something flickered behind his eyes, a shadow of memory that came and went like candlelight in a drafty room. "Your father served at Gettysburg?" the doctor asked quietly. "Yes, sir. 3rd day, during Pickett's charge. He used to tell stories about a Union sniper who saved their position. Men they called Surgeon Sam, on account of how precise his shooting was." Mills continued talking, unaware of the change in the doctor's posture. "Said this fellow could put a bullet exactly where it needed to go, every single time. Never wasted ammunition, never took a shot he couldn't make clean." The doctor's bandaged hand moved to straighten a bottle of laudanum that was already perfectly positioned. "An interesting nickname," he said carefully. "Father always said it was fitting. This sniper fellow had a way of picking his targets that was almost medical, you know? Like he was performing surgery from 500 yards away. Always aimed to stop the threat as efficiently as possible, nothing cruel or wasteful about it." Dr. Whitmore turned back to his work, but his movements had changed subtly. Where before they'd been methodical and calm, now they carried the weight of old memories pressing against carefully constructed walls. The war produced many such men, Sheriff. People who discovered they had talents they'd never suspected and never wanted. Mills nodded enthusiastically, pleased to find someone willing to listen to his family stories. "Father said Surgeon Sam disappeared after the war ended. Just vanished one day, like he'd never existed at all. Always wondered what became of him. Perhaps he found something better to do with those particular skills, Dr. Whitmore suggested, his voice carefully neutral. The doctor moved to his desk and opened the bottom drawer with a small brass key he kept on a chain around his neck. Inside, beneath a few legal documents and some old correspondence, lay something wrapped in oiled cloth. He lifted it out carefully, the weight familiar in his hands despite the years. Mills watched curiously as the doctor unwrapped what appeared to be a rifle unlike any the young sheriff had ever seen. It was longer than a standard carbine, with a heavy barrel and precision sights that spoke of craftsmanship and purpose. The wood was worn smooth from handling, and every metal surface gleamed with the care of regular maintenance. "Sweet Mary," Mills breathed, his eyes widening as recognition dawned. "That's a Sharps rifle. Military issue, sniper configuration. I've only seen pictures of them in my father's war books." Dr. Whitmore ran his uninjured hand along the rifle's stock, his touch gentle as a caress. This particular weapon was manufactured in Hartford, Connecticut, in the spring of 1862. It's accurate to 800 yards in the hands of someone who understands its capabilities. The sheriff's face had gone completely white, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "Doc, that's not just any Sharps rifle. That's the exact model my father described. The one Surgeon Sam carried at Gettysburg." Dr. Samuel Whitmore looked up from the weapon, and Sheriff Mills saw something in those pale blue eyes that made his breath catch. It wasn't fear or uncertainty. It was the look of a man who'd carried secrets for too long and was tired of the weight. "Your father was a good soldier, Sheriff Mills. I remember him well. He never flinched when the gray coats charged our line. Never broke formation even when the world turned to smoke and thunder around us. You should be proud of his service." The words hung in the air between them, confirmation and confession wrapped together in quiet dignity. Mills sank into the chair across from the desk, his hand unconsciously moving to cover his mouth. "Sweet Mary," he whispered. "You're him. You're Surgeon Sam Whitmore." The doctor began disassembling the rifle with movements that spoke of endless repetition. Each component was removed in precise order, cleaned and inspected before being set aside. His hands moved without conscious thought, muscle memory from another lifetime guiding every motion. "I was Samuel Whitmore, late of the 4th Ohio Volunteers," he said quietly, "attached to various units as circumstances required. I served for 3 years and 4 months, and in that time I killed 43 men. All clean shots, all necessary, all haunting my sleep for the 7 years since." Mills struggled to reconcile the gentle healer he'd known with the legendary marksman his father had described in hushed tones. "But Doc, you save lives. You've delivered half the babies in this county. You've never so much as raised your voice to anyone." Dr. Whitmore looked up from his work, and his expression held a sadness deeper than any wound. "That's precisely why I came here, Sheriff. After the war ended, I couldn't stand the sight of my own hands. Every time I looked at them, all I could see was death. I needed to learn if they were capable of something else." The young sheriff watched as the doctor continued his meticulous cleaning, each movement economical and professional. "How did you end up out here in Millbrook?" "I wanted to go somewhere that would never need a sniper," Dr. Whitmore replied simply. "Somewhere quiet and peaceful, where I could spend the rest of my life making amends for the things I'd done in service to my country. 7 years of healing, Sheriff. 7 years of bringing life into the world instead of taking it away." Mills leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Then why are you cleaning that rifle, Doc? Why now?" Dr. Whitmore reassembled the weapon with the same practiced efficiency, each piece sliding into place with satisfying precision. "Because Dutch Carver and his men represent the same kind of threat I faced during the war, Sheriff. They prey on the innocent and defenseless. They use fear as their primary weapon, and they won't stop until someone makes them stop." The sheriff's hand moved to his badge, uncertainty written across his young features. "I could deputize you, Doc. Make it official. Give you the legal authority to act if they come back tomorrow." Dr. Whitmore shook his head gently, loading cartridges into the rifle with movements that were smooth as flowing water. "I appreciate the offer, but some responsibilities can't be shared, Sheriff. What's coming tomorrow is between me and them." "But you can't face 5 armed men alone," Mills protested. "That's suicide, even for someone with your skills." The doctor looked at him with something approaching paternal affection. "Sheriff, I need you to do something for me. When Dutch and his men return tomorrow morning, I want you to make sure every civilian is off the main street. Every woman, every child, every man who doesn't need to be there. Can you do that?" Mills nodded slowly, beginning to understand the gravity of what was being asked. "You really think it's going to come to shooting?" Dr. Whitmore stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street, where lamplight painted everything in soft yellow pools. Dutch Carver has built his reputation on the assumption that decent people won't fight back. Tomorrow morning, he's going to learn that assumption doesn't always hold true. The sheriff joined him at the window, following his gaze toward the edge of town, where Dutch's camp flickered like a handful of fallen stars. "Doc, are you sure about this? Once you pick up that rifle again, there's no going back to being just the town healer." Dr. Whitmore turned away from the window and began preparing ammunition with the same care he brought to mixing medicines. Each cartridge was inspected, weighed, and loaded with powder charges he'd measured to precise specifications. The work was meditative, almost ritualistic. "I've been just the town healer for 7 years, Sheriff," he said quietly. "Tomorrow I need to be something else, just for a little while. Something I hoped I'd never have to be again." Mills watched him work, awed by the transformation taking place before his eyes. The gentle doctor was still there, but underneath lay something harder, more dangerous. A professional killer who'd learned to heal, but never forgotten how to end lives with surgical precision. "My father always said Surgeon Sam was the most dangerous man he'd ever known," Mills said softly. "Not because he was cruel or bloodthirsty, but because he was so calm about it. Said you never seemed to take any pleasure in killing, just did what needed doing and moved on." Dr. Whitmore loaded the last cartridge and set it aside with its companions. "Your father understood something that most people miss, Sheriff. Taking a life isn't something to enjoy or celebrate. It's a tool, nothing more. Sometimes it's the right tool for the job, and sometimes it's the only tool that will work." The clinic fell silent except for the soft sounds of final preparations. Outside, Millbrook slept peacefully, unaware that their gentle healer was preparing for war. In a few hours, Dutch Carver would return expecting to collect tribute from a frightened physician. Instead, he would face Surgeon Sam Whitmore and learn why some legends are better left undisturbed. Sheriff Mills gathered his hat and prepared to leave, his young face grave with responsibility. "I'll make sure the street is clear, document. But promise me something. Dr." Whitmore looked up from checking his rifle's sights one final time. "What's that, Sheriff?" "When it's over, win or lose, you come back to being just Doc Whitmore. This town needs its healer more than it needs another killer." The doctor's expression softened, and for a moment the gentle physician returned. "I'll do my best, Sheriff. But some things, once awakened, don't go back to sleep easily." After Mills left, Dr. Samuel Whitmore sat alone in his clinic surrounded by the tools of two very different professions. Medical instruments gleamed on one side of the room, instruments of healing carefully maintained and ready for service. On the other side lay his rifle and ammunition, instruments of death equally well maintained and infinitely more familiar to his hands than he cared to admit. Tomorrow would bring its own judgment. Tonight, there was only the quiet work of preparation and the weight of old memories pressing against his carefully constructed new life. The transformation was already beginning, and there was no way to stop it now. Dawn painted the eastern sky the color of old blood as Dr. Samuel Whitmore stood in his clinic doorway, watching the main street of Millbrook empty of its usual morning bustle. Sheriff Mills had done his work well during the night hours, quietly visiting every business and residence with urgent warnings about staying indoors until further notice. The doctor held his black medical bag in his left hand, the familiar weight somehow different this morning than it had been for the past 7 years. Inside, carefully disassembled and wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the tools of his former profession. Tools he'd hoped never to touch again, now cleaned and loaded and ready for service. His wire-rimmed spectacles caught the early light as he adjusted them with steady fingers. Everything about his appearance remained exactly as it had been for years. The same gentle demeanor, the same soft-spoken manner, the same unassuming presence that had made him beloved throughout the community. Only his eyes had changed, taking on the distant focus of a man calculating ranges and wind patterns with professional precision. The sound of approaching horses cut through the morning silence like thunder across still water. 8 riders this time, not 5. Dutch Carver had brought reinforcements, confident that overwhelming numbers would crush any resistance the stubborn doctor might offer. They rode with the casual arrogance of men who'd never faced serious opposition, their weapons displayed prominently and their voices loud with anticipation. Dutch dismounted first, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the dusty street. His cold eyes swept the empty businesses and shuttered windows with satisfaction, interpreting the silence as fear rather than preparation. "Smart of them to stay inside," he called out, his voice echoing off the wooden buildings. "Saves us the trouble of having to educate them about minding their own business." Dr. Whitmore remained motionless in his doorway, watching the gang spread out in a loose semicircle around his clinic. Professional assessment flowed through his mind like water finding its level. 8 men, various levels of experience, predictable positioning based on their need to feel superior through intimidation. "Morning, Doc," Dutch said, his tone carrying false friendliness wrapped around naked threat. "Hope you had a good night to think about our conversation yesterday." The doctor's voice remained calm and conversational when he replied. "I spent the evening organizing my thoughts and reconsidering my priorities, if that's what you're asking." Dutch grinned, mistaking composure for submission. "Now that's what I like to hear. Smart man knows when he's beat. So let's make this simple. You've got our money ready, and we'll be on our way to collect from the rest of these fine citizens." Dr. Whitmore stepped forward slowly, his medical bag shifting to his right hand with deliberate precision. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding about my financial situation. You see, I've discovered something interesting about the nature of wealth in a small community like Millbrook." Dutch's grin faded as his patience began wearing thin. The doctor's continued calm was unsettling, like trying to intimidate a statue. "What kind of misunderstanding would that be, Doc?" "The kind where a man learns that his true riches can't be counted in coins, Dr. Whitmore replied, setting his medical bag down carefully at his feet. "In 7 years here, I've delivered 47 babies. I've treated broken bones, fevers, infections, and injuries too numerous to count. I've sat with the dying and comforted the grieving. And in return, this community has given me something more valuable than money." Pike, the wiry gang member with yellow teeth, snorted with derision. "What's that, Doc? Warm feelings and good wishes?" Dr. Whitmore's pale eyes focused on Pike with the kind of attention a hawk gives to a mouse. "They gave me a purpose worth defending," he said quietly. "They gave me something to protect with my life, if necessary." Dutch had heard enough philosophical nonsense from the stubborn healer. His massive hand shot out and caught the doctor across the face, a backhanded blow that sent wire-rimmed spectacles flying into the dust. The sound of the strike echoed off the empty buildings like a gunshot. The doctor stumbled backward but didn't fall, catching himself with practiced balance. When he straightened and turned back to face his attackers, everything about him had changed. The gentle demeanor was gone, stripped away like a discarded coat. His pale blue eyes had taken on the cold focus of winter ice, and his posture spoke of readiness rather than submission. Dutch expected to see fear, pain, maybe even tears from the blow he'd delivered. Instead, he found himself looking into the eyes of a predator, someone who assessed threats with the same clinical detachment others reserved for medical examinations. "That was a mistake," the doctor said, his voice carrying a flat certainty that made Dutch's confidence waver. His tone had lost all warmth, becoming as cold and professional as a surgeon announcing a terminal diagnosis. "You threatening me, old man?" Dutch demanded, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments before. Something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic, and he couldn't quite identify what had changed. Dr. Whitmore reached down and retrieved his spectacles, examining them for damage before settling them back on his nose. The lenses had survived intact, and he cleaned them carefully with a cloth from his vest pocket. "I don't make threats," he said calmly. "I state medical facts. And the fact is, gentlemen, that some conditions can't be cured. Some injuries are permanent. Some patients are beyond saving." Pike nervously fingered his gun but, unsure why the situation felt so different than it had moments before. "Doc, you're talking mighty strange for a man facing 8 armed men." Dr. Whitmore looked at him with mild interest, as if Pike had asked about the weather. 8 men with varying levels of training and experience. I can see from your positioning that none of you have military experience. Your weapons are well maintained, but carried for show rather than professional use. You rely on intimidation rather than skill, which suggests you've never faced competent opposition. The clinical assessment delivered in such matter-of-fact tones unsettled the entire gang. Dutch felt his authority slipping and tried to reassert it through proximity, stepping close enough to loom over the smaller man. You think you're clever, don't you, Doc? Think your fancy words are going to save you from what's coming? Dr. Whitmore met his gaze directly, and Dutch felt something cold crawl up his spine at what he saw in those pale eyes. Cleverness has nothing to do with it. This is simply a matter of professional competence meeting amateur enthusiasm. Sheriff Mills chose that moment to appear around the corner of Henderson's General Store, his young face tense with worry. He'd been watching from concealment as ordered, but the sound of Dutch's blow had made staying hidden impossible. "Doc, are you all right?" Mills called out, his hand resting on his gun, but not drawing. The sight of 8 armed men facing one unarmed physician made his blood boil with righteous anger. "I'm fine, Sheriff Mills," Dr. Whitmore replied without taking his eyes off Dutch. "Just having a conversation about the cost of medical care in our community." Mills stepped closer, his badge catching the morning light. "Dutch, you and your men need to move along. The doctor's made it clear he doesn't have your money, and there's no point in continuing this discussion." Dutch grinned at the young lawman's obvious nervousness. "Stay out of this, boy. This is between me and the good doctor here. Unless you want to make it your problem too." Sheriff Mills drew his revolver with the uncertain movements of someone who'd never fired a shot in anger. Dutch and his men laughed at the display, confident that one nervous youngster posed no real threat to their overwhelming numbers. "Sam," Mills said urgently, not realizing the significance of using the doctor's first name in front of the gang. "Sam, maybe we should just pay them what they want and avoid any trouble." The reaction was immediate and electric. One of Dutch's men, a scarred veteran named Carson who'd ridden with various outlaw gangs across 3 territories, went completely white at the name. His hand froze halfway to his gun, and his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sam? Did he just call you Sam?" Dr. Whitmore noticed Carson's reaction with professional interest. "You seem to recognize that name. How interesting." Carson's face had gone the color of old parchment, and his voice shook when he spoke. "Boss, we need to leave. Right now? We need to leave right now." Dutch snarled at his subordinate's obvious fear. "What the hell's wrong with you, Carson? It's just some old pill-pusher." "Boss," Carson said urgently, his eyes never leaving the doctor's face. "That's not just any old pill-pusher. Look at his eyes. Look at how he's standing. That's Sam Whitmore." The name meant nothing to Dutch, but he could see its effect on Carson and several of the other men who'd served in various conflicts over the years. A reputation that traveled by whispered stories around campfires, growing larger and more terrifying with each retelling. Dr. Whitmore knelt beside his medical bag and opened it with movements that were economical and precise. Instead of medicines and surgical instruments, the bag revealed something wrapped in oiled cloth. He began unwrapping it slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "During the war, I served with the 4th Ohio Volunteers," he said conversationally as he worked, "attached to various units as circumstances required. I developed something of a reputation for precision work at extended ranges." The oiled cloth fell away to reveal the disassembled components of a Sharps rifle, each piece gleaming with careful maintenance. Dutch watched in fascination as the doctor began assembling the weapon with movements that spoke of endless repetition. The barrel locked into place with a satisfying click. The stock fitted perfectly into his shoulder as he tested the balance. The loading mechanism operated with smooth precision as he inserted a carefully prepared cartridge. "They called me Surgeon Sam," the doctor continued, his voice remaining calm and clinical as he worked. "The nickname came from my tendency to place shots with surgical precision. Clean, efficient, no wasted motion or unnecessary suffering." Dutch felt his mouth go dry as he realized what he was watching. The gentle physician had vanished completely, replaced by someone who handled the deadly weapon with the same competence he brought to medical procedures. "This particular rifle is accurate to 800 yards in capable hands, Dr. Whitmore said, bringing the weapon to full readiness with practiced ease. "I've made successful shots at greater distances, but 800 yards represents the reliable range for consistent results. Carson backed away slowly, his hands raised in surrender. Boss, I've heard the stories. This man killed 43 Confederate soldiers during the war. All clean shots through the heart. All from distances that most men can't even see clearly. Dr. Whitmore looked up from his rifle, and his pale eyes held the kind of certainty that came from professional competence. 43 confirmed kills, he corrected gently. All at ranges exceeding 400 yards. All clean shots through center mass. All necessary to protect my fellow soldiers and complete the mission. The numbers hung in the air like smoke, too specific to be invention, too precise to be boasting. Dutch felt something he'd never experienced in years of intimidating helpless civilians. For the first time in his adult life, he was facing someone more dangerous than himself. The distance between us right now is approximately 20 feet, Dr. Whitmore observed, his tone remaining conversational despite the weapon in his hands. At this range, I could place a shot anywhere I chose with absolute certainty. The question becomes not whether I can hit my target, but whether I choose to do so. Dutch's face had gone pale as understanding crashed over him like ice water. He'd come to intimidate a harmless physician and discovered instead that he was within arm's reach of a legendary killer. The man holding that rifle had ended more lives than Dutch's entire gang combined. Now wait just a minute, Dutch stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. We didn't know who you were. This is all just a misunderstanding. Dr. Whitmore shouldered his rifle with fluid grace, the weapon becoming an extension of his body in the way that only came from years of professional use. No misunderstanding at all, he said quietly. You came here to threaten innocent people and collect tribute through violence. I'm simply providing you with a different perspective on the situation. The transformation was complete. The gentle healer had become a weapon of surgical precision, and Dutch Carver's gang found themselves facing the most dangerous man any of them had ever encountered. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows that seemed to emphasize the stark change in circumstances. What happened next would depend entirely on whether Dutch was smart enough to recognize when he was beaten, or foolish enough to test the resolve of a man who'd never missed a shot that mattered. Dutch Carver's hand moved toward his gun with the desperate speed of a man who'd finally realized his life depended on being faster than the legend standing before him. His fingers had barely brushed the grip when Dr. Whitmore's rifle spoke with the authority of precise engineering and professional competence. The bullet took Dutch's revolver clean out of his hand without so much as grazing his skin. The weapon spun through the air like a broken bird before clattering against the hitching post 15 feet away. Dutch stared at his empty holster in disbelief, then at his uninjured hand, then at the man who'd just demonstrated surgical precision at 20 feet with a rifle designed for long-range work. That was your one mistake, Dr. Whitmore said calmly, already working the lever action to chamber another round. The movement was smooth as flowing water, practiced to the point where reloading became an unconscious reflex. From this point forward, gentlemen, any aggressive movement will be met with proportional response. Pike, the Yellowtooth gang member who destroyed the medical supplies the night before, went for his gun anyway. Desperation and disbelief drove him to test whether the stories about Surgeon Sam could possibly be true. His draw was fast by frontier standards, the kind of speed that had intimidated honest citizens across 3 territories. Dr. Whitmore's second shot clipped Pike's ear with mathematical precision, removing a piece of cartilage no larger than a silver dollar while leaving everything else untouched. Pike screamed and clapped his hand to his bleeding ear, his unfired weapon tumbling to the dust as shock overwhelmed his nervous system. I could have taken your head, the doctor observed with clinical detachment. Instead, I provided you with a reminder about the consequences of poor judgment. Consider it a medical consultation. Carson, the scarred veteran who'd recognized the name Sam Whitmore, was backing away slowly with his hands raised high above his head. His experience in various conflicts had taught him to recognize the difference between skilled amateurs and professional killers. This man fell into the latter category without question. Boss, Carson said urgently, his voice cracking with fear. Boss, we need to surrender. Right now? This isn't some lucky shot. This is Surgeon Sam Whitmore. Dutch's pride warred with his survival instinct as he stared at his empty hand. Years of building his reputation through intimidation and violence made submission feel like death itself. But the alternative was facing a man who could place bullets wherever he chose with absolute certainty. 3 more of Dutch's men decided to test their luck simultaneously, spreading out and drawing their weapons in the hope that multiple targets would overwhelm even a legendary marksman. They moved with the coordination of men who'd fought together before, each taking a different angle to divide their opponent's attention. Dr. Whitmore's response was education delivered through applied ballistics. His third shot passed through 2 hat brims simultaneously, the bullet threading between Gus Henderson and Tom Brady with enough precision to part their hair without drawing blood. The 4th shot pinned Jerry Walsh's knife to the wooden support beam of Henderson's general store, the blade quivering from the impact while Walsh stared at his empty hand in amazement. "Those were warning shots," Dr. Whitmore announced, his voice carrying the calm authority of a professor explaining basic principles to slow students. "I have 5 more cartridges loaded, and I can reload this weapon in under 8 seconds. You have approximately 30 seconds to make a decision that will determine whether you leave Millbrook walking or draped over your horses." Sheriff Mills had been watching the demonstration with growing awe and horror. The gentle physician he'd known for years had transformed into something from frontier legends, a killer so skilled that resistance seemed not just futile but absurd. The young lawman's hand trembled on his own weapon as he tried to process what he was witnessing. "Sam," Mills said quietly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might be misinterpreted. "Sam, they're beaten. You don't need to kill them." Dr. Whitmore kept his rifle trained on the remaining gang members while considering the sheriff's words. "You're correct, Sheriff Mills. Unnecessary killing serves no medical purpose. These men can recover from their current condition if they receive proper treatment." "What kind of treatment would that be, Doc?" Dutch asked, his voice hoarse with defeat and barely contained terror. "The kind that involves immediate departure from this community and permanent discontinuation of your current profession," Dr. Whitmore replied. "Consider it preventive medicine. Some conditions are best addressed by removing the patient from the environment that caused the illness." 2 more gang members, brothers named Jake and Cole Murphy, decided to make their own desperate play. They'd been moving slowly toward their horses, hoping to mount up and ride away from the nightmare their morning had become. When they reached their animals, they spurred hard and tried to gallop out of rifle range. Dr. Whitmore tracked their movement with the smooth precision of a clockwork mechanism. His 5th shot took Jake's hat clean off his head at 50 yards. His 6th shot clipped Cole's stirrup leather, sending him tumbling to the ground in a tangle of limbs and bruised pride. Both horses continued running without their riders, leaving the Murphy brothers stranded in the dust. Effective range of this weapon extends considerably beyond the borders of Millbrook, Dr. Whitmore observed, already reloading with the fluid efficiency of long practice. "I recommend against testing that proposition further." Carson had seen enough battlefield carnage to recognize a hopeless situation when it developed around him. "Sweet Mary, boss," he said desperately. "This man's putting bullets exactly where he wants them. Every single shot. That's not luck. That's professional competence." Dutch looked around at his scattered, demoralized gang. His revolver lay 15 feet away, useless as a paperweight. Pike sat in the dust holding his bleeding ear and whimpering. The Murphy brothers were picking themselves up from their involuntary dismounting, covered in dirt and defeat. The rest of his men stood frozen like statues, afraid to move for fear of providing the legendary marksman with an excuse to demonstrate his skills more permanently. "All right," Dutch said finally, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. "All right, we're leaving. We're leaving right now." Dr. Whitmore lowered his rifle slightly, but kept it ready for immediate use. "That's medically sound reasoning. However, I feel obligated to provide some discharge instructions for your condition." Dutch waited, knowing he had no choice but to listen to whatever terms the deadly physician chose to dictate. "First, you will never return to Millbrook or any community within 50 miles of this location. Second, you will find a new profession that doesn't involve threatening innocent people. Third, you will spread word throughout the territory that this town is under the protection of someone who takes such responsibilities very seriously." "What if we don't follow your instructions, Doc?" Pike asked through gritted teeth, still holding his wounded ear. Dr. Whitmore's pale eyes focused on him with the kind of attention that made grown men reconsider their life choices. Then you'll discover that my next demonstration will be considerably less charitable. I spent 3 years perfecting the art of killing at extended range, Mr. Pike. Today's exhibition was merely a gentle reminder of what happens when amateurs attempt to intimidate professionals. Carson had heard enough war stories to fill several lifetimes, but he'd never witnessed marksmanship of this caliber displayed with such clinical detachment. "Boss, we need to collect our gear and ride out immediately. This man could have killed every one of us without breaking a sweat, and he chose not to. We should be grateful for his restraint." Dutch nodded slowly, his pride finally crushed under the weight of absolute defeat. He began gathering his scattered men, helping Pike to his feet, and signaling for the Murphy brothers to collect their horses. The gang that had ridden into Millbrook with such confidence was leaving as a collection of humbled, frightened men who'd learned the difference between reputation and reality. "Wait," Dr. Whitmore called out as they prepared to mount up. Dutch turned back reluctantly, expecting final humiliation or additional demands. Instead, the doctor reached into his vest pocket and produced a small brown bottle. "This is laudanum," he said, tossing it to Pike. "For the pain in your ear. Change the bandage twice daily and keep the wound clean. It should heal without permanent damage if you follow proper medical care." Pike caught the bottle with his good hand, staring at it in bewilderment. "You're giving me medicine? After shooting me?" Dr. Whitmore's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I'm a physician, Mr. Pike. My oath requires me to treat injuries regardless of how they were acquired. The fact that I caused your wound doesn't exempt me from my responsibility to help you heal from it." The gesture broke something in Pike's defiant spirit. Nobody had shown him kindness after violence since he was a child, and the unexpected mercy from the man who'd just demonstrated his lethal competence left him speechless. Dutch mounted his horse slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. He looked down at the doctor one final time, trying to understand how he'd so completely misjudged the situation. "Doc," he said quietly, "what you did here today, this demonstration, it's going to become legend. Men will tell stories about Surgeon Sam Whitmore for decades to come." Dr. Whitmore broke open his rifle and began removing the remaining cartridges, each movement economical and precise. "Legends are just stories, Mr. Carver. What matters is that good people can sleep safely in their beds tonight without fear of men like you." The gang rode out slowly, their earlier swagger replaced by the careful movements of men who'd looked death in the eye and found it wearing wire-rimmed spectacles and carrying a medical degree. They didn't look back, and they didn't speak until they were well beyond rifle range of the most dangerous man they'd ever encountered. Sheriff Mills holstered his unused weapon and approached the doctor carefully. "Sam, that was the most incredible display of marksmanship I've ever witnessed. You could have killed them all without breaking a sweat." Dr. Whitmore finished disassembling his rifle, wrapping each component in oiled cloth with the same care he brought to storing surgical instruments. "Killing them would have served no constructive purpose, Sheriff. They were already beaten the moment they recognized my name. Everything after that was simply medical education about the consequences of poor life choices." "But Doc," Mills pressed, "what if they don't stay gone? What if they come back with more men, or try to ambush you from a distance?" Dr. Whitmore looked up from his work, and his pale eyes held the quiet confidence of a man who'd faced every conceivable threat during 3 years of war. "Sheriff, I killed 43 Confederate soldiers who were considerably more skilled and motivated than Dutch Carver's gang. They won't be back, and word of what happened here today will ensure that no one else makes the same mistake." The doctor closed his medical bag and straightened his coat, the transformation back to gentle healer already beginning. The rifle was wrapped and stored away, the legend of Surgeon Sam returning to whatever shadows had hidden it for 7 years. From the windows and doorways around Millbrook's Main Street, curious faces began to appear. The townspeople had heard the gunshots and seen the gang's humiliating departure. They emerged slowly, like flowers opening after a storm, ready to reclaim their community from the fear that had gripped it for months. Mrs. Henderson appeared in her store doorway, looking at the doctor with new understanding. "Dr. Whitmore," she called out, "thank you for protecting us." The doctor touched the brim of his hat politely. "It was my pleasure, Mrs. Henderson. Sometimes the best medicine is preventing disease before it spreads too far. As the morning sun climbed higher, painting Millbrook in golden light, Dr. Samuel Whitmore walked back into his clinic to begin cleaning up the destruction from the previous night. There were medical supplies to organize, equipment to repair, and patients to tend. The work of a healer, honest and peaceful. But everyone in town now knew that their gentle physician carried within him something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Millbrook was under the protection of a legend, and that knowledge would keep them safe for years to come. 3 weeks had passed since Dutch Carver's gang rode out of Millbrook with their tails between their legs, and Dr. Samuel Whitmore had settled back into the gentle rhythms of his healing practice. His hands moved with the same steady precision they'd always shown as he examined little Sarah Chen's scraped knee, cleaning the wound with careful attention while her mother watched anxiously. The child had taken a tumble while playing in the street, something that would have been impossible just a month ago when Dutch's men controlled the town through fear and intimidation. Now children ran freely through Millbrook's dusty roads, their laughter echoing off buildings like music after a long silence. "There now, Sarah," the doctor said gently, applying a clean bandage with practiced ease. "Keep this dry for a few days and come see me again next week. You'll be good as new in no time." Mrs. Chun bowed gratefully, her eyes holding the special warmth reserved for someone who'd saved her family from months of terror. The whole community looked at Dr. Whitmore differently now, though they tried not to let it show. They still saw their beloved physician, but underneath lay the knowledge that their gentle healer was also their protector. As Mrs. Chun gathered up her daughter to leave, young Tommy Patterson burst through the clinic door with the boundless energy that only 80-year-old boys possessed. His split lip had healed perfectly from his earlier injury, leaving no trace of the accident that had brought him here the night Dutch's gang first visited. "Doc," Tommy announced breathlessly, "my pa says you're a hero like in the stories. He says you fought off a whole gang of bad men all by yourself." Dr. Whitmore cleaned his hands in the wash basin, considering his words carefully. "Heroes come in many forms, Tommy. Sometimes the most heroic thing is choosing not to fight when you have the power to do terrible damage. But you had a rifle," Tommy pressed, his eyes wide with the fascination that young boys held for tales of adventure and danger. "Why don't you wear it like the gunslingers in the dime novels? All the heroes carry guns, so everyone knows how dangerous they are." The doctor dried his hands and knelt to meet Tommy's eyes directly. "Real strength isn't in the weapon, son. It's in knowing when not to use it. A gun hanging on your hip tells everyone you're ready to kill. I'd rather they know I'm ready to heal." Tommy considered this with the serious concentration of childhood. "So you're still the same doc you always were?" Dr. Whitmore smiled, and the gentleness that had defined him for 7 years shone through completely. "I'm exactly the same man I was before, Tommy. I just had to remind some folks that good people deserve to live in peace." The boy nodded solemnly and scampered off to share this wisdom with his friends, leaving Dr. Whitmore alone with his thoughts and his medical supplies. The clinic had been completely restored in the weeks since the confrontation, every bottle replaced, and every instrument cleaned and organized to his exacting standards. Sheriff Mills appeared in the doorway as the afternoon light began to slant through the windows. The young lawman had grown considerably in confidence since witnessing Dr. Whitmore's demonstration of professional competence, though he still carried himself with the careful respect of someone who'd seen legend made flesh. "Afternoon, Doc," Mills said, settling into the chair across from the examination table. "Got some news you might find interesting." Dr. Whitmore looked up from his inventory with mild curiosity. "Good news or bad news, Sheriff? Depends on your perspective, I suppose." Mills pulled a folded telegram from his vest pocket. Word came through the territorial marshal's office. Dutch Carver's gang broke up completely after they left here, scattered to the four winds, and most of them have given up the outlaw life entirely. The doctor nodded thoughtfully. "Fear is a powerful motivator for career changes. What about Dutch himself?" Mills grinned. "Last anyone heard, he was working as a freight handler in Denver. Apparently, he tells everyone who'll listen about the most dangerous man in the Colorado Territory and how smart he was to walk away from their encounter." "That's medically sound reasoning on his part," Dr. Whitmore observed. "Some patients require dramatic intervention to understand the seriousness of their condition." The sheriff leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. "Doc, Your reputation has traveled faster than you might expect. We've had inquiries from 3 other territorial marshals about whether you'd consider helping with some particularly troublesome outlaw problems they've been facing. Dr. Whitmore's hands stilled in their work. What did you tell them, Sheriff? Mills smiled. I told them that Dr. Samuel Whitmore is Millbrook's physician, and he's not available for consultation outside his medical practice. That part of his life is closed permanently. The doctor's expression softened with gratitude. I appreciate that, Sheriff Mills. Samuel Whitmore the soldier served his purpose during the war. Dr. Samuel Whitmore the healer is who I choose to be for the rest of my days. Both men understood that the choice wasn't entirely up to him. If serious threats emerged that required his particular skills, the gentle physician would step aside and let Surgeon Sam handle the situation. But for now, and hopefully forever, Millbrook's doctor could focus on saving lives instead of taking them. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. A teenage boy entered nervously, his face flushed with embarrassment and determination. Dr. Whitmore recognized him as Marcus Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's nephew who'd come to help with the store after his uncle's death. Doc, Marcus said hesitantly, I was wondering if you might consider taking on an apprentice. Someone to help with your medical work and maybe learn the profession. Dr. Whitmore studied the young man's earnest face. Medical training is demanding work, Marcus. It requires steady hands, careful attention to detail, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. What makes you think you'd be suited for such responsibilities? Marcus straightened his shoulders with evident determination. I watch what you did for our town, Doc. Not the fighting part, but everything else. The way you've cared for everyone here for 7 years, never asking for more than folks could afford to pay. I want to learn to help people the way you do. The doctor exchanged a glance with Sheriff Mills, who nodded encouragingly. Very well, Marcus. We'll start with basic anatomy and wound care. Come by tomorrow morning after you finish your duties at the store. The boy's face lit up with joy and gratitude. Thank you, Document. I promise I'll work hard and learn everything you can teach me. After Marcus left, Dr. Whitmore opened his medicine cabinet to retrieve supplies for the next day's lessons. Among the bottles and instruments sat a small wooden box that he rarely opened, containing medals and commendations from his service during the war. The Military Medal of Honor rested on faded blue ribbon, recognition for actions he'd tried to forget but could never entirely escape. Steady hands save lives, he murmured to himself, closing the cabinet without touching the box. Whether you're removing a bullet or putting one exactly where it needs to go. Sheriff Mills prepared to leave, gathering his hat and adjusting his badge. Doc, can I ask you something that's been bothering me since that morning 3 weeks ago? Of course, Sheriff. When you were assembling that rifle and facing down Dutch's gang, you looked completely calm, like you were just going about normal business. Weren't you afraid at all? Dr. Whitmore considered the question carefully. Fear is a natural response to danger, Sheriff Mills. But I learned during the war that fear becomes manageable when you accept that some things are worth dying for. That morning, protecting this community was worth any risk to my personal safety. The young lawman nodded slowly. Sometimes I wonder how different I'd be if I'd seen the things you saw during the war. Dr. Whitmore's expression grew distant, touched by memories he carried like old scars. Sometimes we must become what we hate to protect what we love, Sheriff. The important thing is finding your way back afterward. Some men never do. Mills left quietly, understanding that he'd been given a glimpse into the philosophical struggle that defined Dr. Whitmore's daily existence. The choice between healing and killing, between the man he'd been and the man he'd chosen to become. As evening settled over Millbrook, Dr. Whitmore completed his preparations for the next day's medical practice. His hands moved with their customary steadiness as he organized instruments and mixed compounds. The same precision that had made him legendary in another life now dedicated entirely to preserving health and saving lives. Outside his window, the town settled into peaceful sleep. Children played in streets that were safe again, shopkeepers closed their doors without fear of violent visitors, and families gathered around dinner tables to share the simple blessing of security. Mrs. Henderson's store remained open late, serving customers who no longer hurried through their business with anxious glances over their shoulders. Dr. Samuel Whitmore had spent 3 years learning to take lives with surgical precision, and 7 years learning to save them with equal skill. The war had made him into something he'd never wanted to be, but Millbrook had allowed him to become the man he'd always hoped to be. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own opportunities to heal and help and preserve the precious peace they'd all fought to protect. There would be children with scraped knees, expectant mothers needing care, and elderly folks requiring gentle attention for the aches and pains that came with long lives well lived. And if dangerous men ever threatened his community again, Dr. Samuel Whitmore would put down his medical instruments and pick up his rifle, because some things were worth killing for, and some people were worth dying to protect. But tonight, Millbrook slept safely under the protection of a legend who asked only to be remembered as their doctor, and that was enough. If you enjoyed this tale of hidden strength protecting innocent people, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage and justice. We bring you tales of ordinary folks discovering extraordinary resolve every week. Comment below with where you're listening from. And remember that real heroes often hide in plain sight among us. Until next time, may you find the strength to protect what matters most when the moment demands it.